In the last class, I read a paragraph, and I didn't, until the very end of it, I didn't mention who wrote the paragraph. So I'm going to read the paragraph again, but this time I'm not going to stop and explain anything. I'm just going to read the paragraph again so you could get the full sense of the paragraph. This was written by Leonard Cohen, who is a well-known songwriter, musician, and Leonard Cohen got interested in Zen and went to Bald Mountain in San Francisco, where a famous Japanese Zen master was teaching, and became a student to that Zen master. And Leonard Cohen actually became a lay monk and was given the name Jikan. And so he practiced at Bald Mountain, and he also, near the end of his life, was a student of my Zen teacher, David Radin, and spent time with him. And David shared with me that when Leonard Cohen was dying, he took counsel with David Radin, and David Radin helped him to kind of let go and relax and accept the end of his physical life. And if you're interested, if you go on YouTube, there's actually, if you go on YouTube and you look up Leonard Cohen, there's actually some video of him with the Zen master, showing him at Bald Mountain and spending time with the Zen master. So here's what he wrote. He said, "Meditation is not what you think. You sit in absolute silence and your mind starts going over all your movies. During that process, you become so familiar with the scripts you keep in your life that you end up getting sick of them. Then you realize that the person you think you are is nothing but a complicated script you spent most of your energy on. After a more thorough examination, you discover your personality disgusts you, and that's because it's not really you. If you feel terrified enough about that personality, you spontaneously allow it to fade away. And then, if you're lucky, you can experience yourself without the distortion of that personality." So that's his statement. So I thought tonight I'd kind of take a risk and try and talk about something that's harder than some of the things I've already talked about. And it can lead to confusion, especially after having read what I just read, because what I just read basically says you are not the personality, and that's one way that the teachings teach, is that you're not the personality, right? That makes it a bit difficult, because when we say you're not the personality, then obviously the question that arises is, okay, then what am I? And we talk about the idea that your true nature is awareness itself, right? That's the real you, and so forth and so on. But that's one way of talking about this. There are other ways to talk about this. And one of the things that is considered to be the heart of the matter, it's spoken of very clearly in the Heart Sutra, if you've ever studied the Heart Sutra. Considered the heart of the matter is the concept of the teaching of no self. That is a central teaching in Buddhism, no self. The Heart Sutra is that teaching of no self. So I just got done saying that when I read that paragraph, it said that you are not the personality, you're not the physical body, you're not the thinker of the thoughts. These are all the things that we typically talk about here. But then what that leaves you with is, okay, then I am awareness. That I am awareness. Well, then that's still not the teaching, because if you say I am awareness, all you did was say, instead of being the personality, instead of that being the self, awareness is the self. But the Buddhist teaching is no self. So the teaching is saying, no, you're not the personality, and you're not the awareness either. So I'm taking a risk here talking this way, and because people have been confused about talking about it the other way. So now I'm going to throw another curveball, right? So what I would recommend that you do is not get too heavy about it, not get too concerned about this, but just look at it in terms of giving it consideration. That's where I think this can be useful, is give it consideration. Don't think you have to conclude anything, okay? Now, one way that I came across talking about it in this other way, talking about no self, is I came upon, as I usually do come upon things, I came upon a teaching that was offered from the Bar Center for Buddhist Studies. And there is a very high esteemed Buddhist philosophy teacher there that gave a 4-part course online. And his name was Jay Garfield. And in this 4-part course, he talks about losing yourself, how to be a person without a self. Right? Losing yourself, how to be a person without a self. So what he's saying is, by saying that, what he's saying is that if the way you understand the teachings is, I am not the physical body, I am not the personality, those are appearances, those are illusions, that's a form that I'm appearing in. And then the first thing that happens is you say, well, okay, I am the awareness. Well, that creates a problem, because the awareness has no form, right? Has no form, doesn't exist in time, has no shape. It doesn't show up. It doesn't show up. Awareness doesn't show up. You could call it emptiness. You could say it's emptiness. That's often talked about as the void or emptiness, awareness. And so in this 4-part teaching, and you can get this online if you're interested in it. It's a whole thing with slideshows and everything. And one of the things that he's talking about here is that when you come to the conclusion that, okay, I'm not the personality of the body, I'm not my mind, okay, my true nature is awareness itself, so that you end up feeling that at least you have an identity, at least you have a place to end up, right, to be the awareness itself. But the Buddhist teachings say that that's not a self. Awareness is not a self. And until you get clear about that, you still have not seen the truth. Until you experience that truth, you have not experienced the truth. And one of the ways this guy talks about it is to say that, in fact, what he says is that you are a person, but you're not a self. How to be a person without a self. You are a person, but you're not a self. This is getting really closer to the heart of the matter, because it is the case that you are a person. That's your piece on the board. That's the form you're in. That's how you're interacting with the world, right? And so, but the person is not a self. The person, I've talked about that here, and the teachings talk about that and say the person is a process. The person is a thought activity that generates an illusion that it is real, by pointing to the body as a form it's in. It gives it a form, the body, right? Or it gives it a form, there's a lot of forms that it appears in, a lot of ways that it manifests itself. Right? But what this teaching is telling us is that personality is not a self, it's a process. And you are that process. You are being that process in the world. You have to be that process in the world. You don't have any choice. If you stop being that process in the world, you go to a locked ward, because you would start being crazy. You wouldn't be behaving as a normal human being. What would you be if you weren't who you were conditioned to believe you are? So what these teachings are saying is that, you have taken the identity of that person. You've taken the identity of that conditioned form, the form of a body and that person. You've taken that identity. And that's what you are for all practical reasons, because that's how you show up in the world, right? And then, they say, but the reality of it is, what will give you freedom, what will allow you to experience peace, happiness, well-being, and satisfaction is to understand that while that's a process and while you've taken on that identity, when you're living in that identity, you don't have happiness, peace, satisfaction available to you, because in that identity, you're in a time situation, you're in a circumstantial situation, okay? And in that situation, you appear to be separate from the rest of the world. You appear to be lacking a sense of peace. You appear to be lacking a sense of well-being and satisfaction. And so that identity that you are as a person or personality then pursues those things through getting material possessions, getting what you want, having a certain experience that you call happiness, like that. And so that's the typical process that goes on for a person. But then this other teaching is saying, okay, in order to get access to happiness, well-being, and peace, you have to come to see that your real nature, which only exists in the present moment, right? Your real nature is awareness itself, or consciousness itself, which only exists in the present moment, has no form. And when you can recognize that, when you can get into the being of that experience, then happiness is there, peace is there, satisfaction is there. It's just spontaneously available to you when you recognize awareness as the self. However, that's incomplete, because you're still attempting to land somewhere as an identity, aren't you? If you're saying you're not the personality or the body, you want to end up somewhere, you want to land somewhere, right? Otherwise, you don't exist, okay? Well, the teachings and the higher teachings that talk about this, that talk about no self, what these teachings are saying is that consciousness is impersonal. It is not a self. Remember, this notion of self is the idea of self is like a specific thing, right? A noun, a thing, a something is the self, a specific thing, right? But awareness is no specific thing. Awareness is no specific thing. So the teachings, the real freedom lies in the understanding and the direct experience of the truth, which is there is no self. Literally, there is no self. That's what you have to kind of get clear about. And one of the ways this fellow that was teaching this was talking about is he was saying that there are things that appear to be so that aren't so. And he uses this optical illusion. I don't know how many of you have ever seen this optical illusion, right? And it is clearly an illusion because none of these lines are all the same length. And yet when you look at it, it defies that, it just doesn't look that way. It appears that they're not the same length, when in fact they are the same length. And the fellow that was teaching this course that I mentioned uses that as an example of how something can appear to be so, look like it's the case, and in reality it's just not the case. Right? One example of that is that we think of ourselves as being separate from everything but ourselves, right? We think as the body as the end of me, and what's out here is not me, right? And what the teachings tell us is that's a conditioned optical illusion. If you could see through glasses that were non-dual, you would not see any difference between the end of your body and what seems to be different from it. You wouldn't see any difference, because in reality, in truth, there is no difference, there is no separation. Your body is literally not separate from that which you think it is separate from. Now that's a pretty powerful illusion, isn't it? I mean, you live in that illusion every day, right? But if you really want to get the freedom that's available, that's talked about, for example, in the Heart Sutra and these higher teachings, you have to start to consider the possibility that you have to leave the conceptual understanding of these matters and allow yourself to consider the truth that there is no self, that the awareness is not a self, The awareness is not separate from anything. In the Heart Sutra, it says emptiness is form and form is emptiness. So it's saying that the awareness that you consider yourself to be and the form it's taken itself in as the body and the personality are both the same thing. They're not different. They're both the same thing. They're non-dual. They're both the same thing. Right? So then what this guy is talking about starts to make sense. You are a personality, but you have no self. You are not a self. So the freedom the understanding provides is that without a self, nothing can happen to you. You get that? Without a self, there is nothing separate from anything else in which anything can happen to. This is the freedom. This is the real freedom. This is the freedom that if you actually, if it actually becomes the experience that's there, not the experience you're having, right, but the experience that's there, right? If it actually becomes experience that's there, then you will literally no longer experience the fear of death. Because if there's no self, there's nothing to die. You know, if you have that experience, there's nothing to die. There was nothing that was ever born. There's something that appeared to be born that I took and I identified myself with, that I continue to identify myself with. Now this is very practical and useful because if that's the case, it means that you're free to manipulate the personality because you're not it anymore, right? You know that you're not it in terms of being the awareness, but you know that you're being it. You know that you've identified with it. It is the identity that you have. So the idea that you're not really it starts to collapse because even the form that it is the emptiness at the same time. Emptiness is form and form is emptiness, right? But the concern we have is the idea that we are this personality. Right? Why? Because this personality is what's interacting with my life. And this personality, if this personality is dysfunctional, if this personality is reactive, if there's no context in which to understand the behavior of this personality, then there's going to be a lot of suffering going on. And there is a lot of suffering going on all over the world, right? But if you start to understand that you're being a personality, you're actually not a personality, and you're not a personality. Do you see what I'm saying? This is why this gets a little hairy, right? You're actually not a personality, and you're not a personality because emptiness is form and form is emptiness. But you're identified as a personality, and you're identified as being in time and space, and that's the life that you're involved with right now. So these understandings allow a couple of things to happen. One of the things to happen if you practice meditation, which means you're practicing letting go of the idea that you're a form. Because when you stop giving attention to thinking, you're letting go of the idea that I'm a form. You're allowing yourself to just experience the awareness that is formless. And that awareness that is formless is not a self. It's not personal. It's not separate from anything. And when you allow yourself to experience that and you relax the physical body and you calm the mind, you get quiet enough, it becomes possible for that reality to become the reality that is being experienced. And it is not a form and it is not empty. It's both at the same time. But in the world, it takes the form of the body and the personality, right? So, but if you know the truth, you're not limited. See, the problem that people experience is they don't know the other side of the coin. They're limited to being something that is part of the story, part of the picture, not the whole story. It's incomplete, right? And so if you practice meditation and you start to have the availability of the emptiness as well as the form, now you have the emptiness available to experience happiness, satisfaction, well-being, because that is available only when there is no form. When you're in a form, the satisfaction, well-being, and peace of mind is limited by the circumstances the form finds itself in. Is any of this making any sense at all?
Well, I'm confused about the term self that you're using, because some of these teachers refer to self meaning consciousness,
Yeah.
awareness.
Yeah.
Here you seem to be using self as the small s, meaning personality.
No, I'm saying there's no self. That's the thing.
Which self are you referring to? The bigger self?
No, I'm not referring to any self because I'm saying there's no self. That's the thing that you have to reach for in what I'm talking about. There's no self. I'm saying that you're identified with the body and the personality. That doesn't make it a self. It's an identity you've taken on. A self means it's really you, right? A self means it's really... One of the ways this teacher talks about is he says, one of the ways you can identify this self that I'm talking about that you consider to be really you, right? If you get really angry, who's angry? If you get really upset, who's upset? If you're really afraid, who's afraid? Now see, we don't understand that when you're really afraid, we use the fear to imply there's a me that's afraid. That's how this works. But there's no evidence for any me that's afraid. But we just take that, we just take that on as a belief and we assume that it's true because I feel afraid. See, I'm using the fear to infer that there's somebody afraid. I feel afraid, right? But the evidence indicates there is nobody that's afraid. It's just fear. Fear is just happening. There is no self. There is no self. There's a personality that's afraid, but that's an identity, a conditioned identity that I've taken on. I didn't know I took it on because I had no understanding of anything else. And so when I took it on, I assumed that's all there is. I assume that's me. I assume time and space are reality. And that's what I'm living my life in. That's what I'm trying to get to work. That's what I'm trying to get to work to make me happy and have peace and satisfaction. None of that is working. It can't possibly happen because it's not available. It's not available to the form you've taken. It's not available to the identity you've taken because that identity has separated itself from the possibility of happiness, satisfaction, well-being because it's in a time-space situation now where that's not available. And it thinks it is available and it's available somehow in the situation I'm in, right? But what the teachings are telling us is no, it's never available in the situation that you're in, and it's always available, right, when the experience, not the experience you're having, but the experience that is existing, right, is had in which you realize that your personality is an identity that you've taken on, but that identity in reality is the awareness. Emptiness is form, form is emptiness. And when that becomes evident, right, then freedom from the limitations of this becomes available. And you begin to experience that this isn't the whole story. Therefore, I can experience at any time freedom from the limitations that exist from being this. I can experience at any time by recognizing that's occurring as a thinking activity. And if I let that go and I calm the system down, I start to experience the other side of the equation, the emptiness, the formlessness. And the experience of that as itself is one that's free from limitations and happy, satisfied, and peaceful. So you really do have to go further and get to the no self. You got to take this slow because this is a lot for the mind to process, right? And it's so radically different from the orientation of identifying with the personality. It's so radically different from the idea that you're a physical body and a personality, because now you're really getting to the heart of the matter. That's why it's called the Heart Sutra. You're getting to the heart of the matter, which is even if you realize I'm not this body, I'm not this personality, and then you think, oh, my true nature is this awareness. Rupert Spira would call this a concession, right? Because if you brought somebody from ignorance all the way to what I'm saying right now, they could never go that far. They'd go crazy. So this is something that takes a little time. You gotta kind of wade into the deep end of this pool, right? But when you start to get a sense of it, if you start to get a sense of this idea of no self, right? You can start to actually get a sense of the freedom it makes available, because if there's no self, there's no me, there's nothing that's separate, right? You can start to get a taste of the freedom that's available when you're free from the when you're free from the idea that you're a physical body, a mind, and a self, that there is no self. You're free from the idea that there isn't a self. And so all there is then is a non-dual reality of what's happening. And if you can successfully practice, this takes practice because you had to practice getting into the identity of the personality. So if you successfully practice this over time, a little bit at a time, right, until you can get the equation to work, right, personality, emptiness, right, zero is in the middle, right? So you can get the equation to work so that instead of being one or the other, you're both at the same time all the time. That's the fulfillment of the possibility of a human life. That now you're not just a body and a personality, right? But you're not saying, okay, I'm not that, but I got to land somewhere, so I'll be the awareness now. And see, that doesn't work. That confuses people. But how do I be the awareness? What's that look like, right? That's not possible. You can't just be the awareness. That'll happen after you die, and it was happening before you were born. In the meantime, you've got to deal with the form. You've got to deal with the identity. Now, the good news is, if you know that there is no self there, if you know there's no self there, right, then there is the freedom to make dramatic changes to the structure and form of this. But if you believe you're this, you see, this is where psychology fails. If you believe you're this, right, then you take everything personal. So if the therapist tells you you need to make radical changes in your personality if you want to be happy in your life and your relationships, you feel like the therapist is saying there's something wrong with you. You know, that you're being made wrong. You know, you're being made the problem. You didn't come for that. You came to tell the therapist about the other people that are the problem, right? So that's where psychology fails, right? But the reality of it is, if you come to understand the truth, you then begin to see it's not hard at all to make dramatic changes in the personality, because now I have a way of relating to it that's not limited by it anymore. I have a way of relating to it that's not limited by it. This is the realm of the miraculous. This is the realm of the miraculous. Why? Because when I'm free from the limitations of trying to operate inside the psychology that I am, when I'm free from that, then things can happen that seem impossible. That would make it a miracle, right? Things could happen that seem impossible. Somebody can become a completely different person out of the realization that there's no self. Do you see that? You could become a completely different person out of the realization there's no self. Because you realize if there's no self, there's nothing to gain, there's nothing to lose, there's nothing to be proud of, there's nothing to feel guilty about. All of that just goes away, right? And then you're freed up to be able to look more closely at how the identity you've taken on as a personality is interacting with other identities and how it's interacting with the supposed separate world. And you can start to make refinements there so that your functionality becomes more effective. You get along better with people, you know, you get along better with life, you get along better with the world, right? Because now you're not operating with half the equation anymore. You got the other side of the equation in place, right? And now you have this zero place. You can walk the path now. You can walk the razor's edge now because you see both, you have both sides of the story. Is this getting through it all?
But they're not equal sides, right? Because it seems like emptiness is superior to form. That form is this personality that's this false identity that we carry, but emptiness is the truth.
There is only one truth. You just split it into two.
Right.
Yeah. And so, but I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's easy. That's why this is confusing, because it's easy to look at it that way, right? But the reality of it is that there is nothing better than anything else. Everything is exactly the same. All there is, it goes back to what Ramesh Balsekar said. All there is awareness. All there is awareness. It exists in emptiness. It exists without form, and it exists as form. Same thing.
But it's the form that has to be worked on, not the emptiness.
Well, the form can't be worked on without the emptiness. Because then it's you, then it's personal, right? Then you're going to have an ego, then you're going to have defenses, then you're going to be avoiding anything that threatens your existence as that identity. But when you know the other side of the equation, that's not going on anymore. Your identity is not threatened anymore, you know. Then you can study the 8 verses for training the mind that's given in Zen, right? And you can study and you can understand how it works, right? You get the kind of the code to unlock it. Because unless you get the code to unlock it, if you read the 8 verses to training the mind, it's an insult. It's an insult to the personality. Because in the 8 verses of training the mind, it says, in any situation where there's conflict with other people, you always take the lowest thing. You let them be right and you take the lowest thing. It doesn't matter what the truth is. You take the lowest thing. You know, personality hears that and saying, oh no, that doesn't work. That can't work. That's not. The only reason it looks that way is because you've identified yourself as that personality. And if you think you're the personality, you can't take the hit. But if you know you're not the personality, it doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong anymore. What matters is getting along. And getting along may mean that you give up your position without any concern about what's absolutely true or absolutely wrong. You're just giving up your position. And by doing that, you're saying, I'm interested in being connected and related. I'm not interested in being separated and maintaining a position of self-righteousness. That trains the mind, because the mind has it that you are separate and you have to survive. And you can't allow anything like that to happen. So if you do allow it to happen, you're training your mind to stop functioning that way, to stop considering that identity to be the whole truth, because it's not the whole truth. It's only the whole truth when the other side of the equation is in existence. And the other side of the equation is always in existence, right? But our orientation is so much on one side of it, the idea of form and the personality, and humanity is living on that side of the equation. So it's easy to think that side of the equation is all there is, but it's not all there is. It's only half the truth, and as half the truth, it can't work. It can't work. You can't experience fulfillment and satisfaction because it's not available in the limited form you're in, because the form you're in is limited.
So the idea is to hold these ideas in your head, consider them, and then continue with the practice until the moment where the light bulb goes on.
Yeah, that's a fair way of talking about it, yeah. Yeah, to just get that the truth is the truth, and then practice allowing yourself to continue to be aware of the other side of the equation all the time. That's the practice. In meditation, that's primarily what you're doing. You're coming out of the thought process, which is generating one side of the equation, and when you come out of that and relax, the other side of the equation starts to become visible. Yeah. And so if you practice that consistently, right, the person can't become this. The person, see, that's what will happen. The person will try and become the awareness. That's how it occurs to the person, right? The person can't become this because there already is that. All it has to understand is it's a limited form of that, and it has to function by being informed by this. Then it can function in a much more effective way in the world, because it's not attached to beliefs anymore. It's not attached to things being a certain way anymore. You can let all that go and allow yourself to be aware of what's happening in such a way where the limited identity that you had is not the primary focus. The primary focus is now zero. The primary focus now is to walk the path, to know the truth of who I am, and to know that part of that truth is I have an identity that I am being. So this is, this requires practice. It requires, and I would recommend, this four-piece course that this Buddhist philosopher is delivering. He's basically saying, I will argue philosophically with you in such a way where I will convince you that there is no self. And you are a personality, and that's an identity that you've taken on, right? But that's not a self. And when you think you're the awareness instead of that, that's not a self either, because there is no self. And that's where the freedom is.
What's the name of the teacher?
I'll send this out on the email list if you're on the email list. It's from the Bar Center for Buddhism, and the teacher's name is Jay Garfield. And it's a 4-part series that he does, and slideshow, and you can print the slideshow and the whole thing. But you have to understand that what he's doing here is he's teaching. So he's teaching something. So these are conceptual understandings about this stuff, right? So, right. But the conceptual understandings are pointing to something that's non-conceptual, that's always occurring. It's always occurring as it actually is. It's always occurring as it actually is. And that's why he uses that illusion, right, to say that things are, for most of us, things aren't occurring as they actually are. They're occurring as we think they are. They're occurring as we've been conditioned to consider them to be. And that's not actually the way they are. That's why the illusion is useful, because it seems so, it appears to be so, but it's not actually so. And it is possible, it has to be possible for you to be what you are, right? Which is not, see, and that's where this gets really difficult. So I'm saying it's possible for you to be what you are, and then I'm telling you, but there's no self. So what you are is nothing. What you are is zero. And that zero is the awareness that is no form, and the personality that is a form. And when that balance is there, when the middle way exists, that's what the Buddha called it, the middle way. When the middle way exists, you can be in the world but not of the world, and be very effective in the world. All right?
I keep thinking to be this way, you're becoming like sheep. You know, you're just kind of going along like sheep.
Right, and that's a thought that the personality has. Right? Because this is threatening to the personality, because the belief that you've been living as is that you are that. And therefore, when you hear you're not that, it's got to produce a defense. Right? So that's one of the reasons you have to train yourself not to believe the thoughts, because the thoughts are coming from a program that's designed for your survival, and the survival it's designed for is the survival of the identity that you're being, which is not real. It's just an identity. It works as an identity. It doesn't work as a self, right? It works as a character that you're acting out as, but it doesn't work as a self, because it's not a self. It's a program running that you've identified with, and it's very limited. And that explains the suffering, and that explains the lack, that explains something's missing here, because you're living on one side of the equation. So this isn't something that, don't worry about it if this is confusing. Don't worry about it if you get counter thoughts about it, right? Or it doesn't seem to fit if you try and fit it into the situation. This takes time and practice to get used to the other side of the equation, to get used to being no thing, to get used to that no self is the truth. It takes practice to get used to that. It ends up not being threatening at all. What's threatening is being the personality. Right? Because that's limited, and it appears in a physical form that's going to die. Right?
So if you have no self, you have no preferences, so who do you vote for?
Whoever you vote for, because in the world of no self, right, what's happening is a function of cause and effect. That's what's happening. So who you'd vote for is what the causes are that end up the effect of who you vote for. Because there's no self. There is no you to vote for anybody. It gets pretty interesting if you get into it, you know, and you don't, if you can get this without psychedelics, that's a good thing. All right. See you next time. I hope that something came across. I was trying, because one of the people commented on the YouTube things. He said that I am repeating myself or something like that, right? And that's true to a certain extent, because a lot of this stuff requires repetition, right? Because you're trying to train the mind in a different way than it was trained before. But I also took that to heart in terms of, okay, you want to go deeper? You want to go farther? Take this. Try and chew on this.